Warfare. It is tantamount and paramount in our stories, in culture, in history, and in legend. And as a result, large-scale battles have become a fixture of tabletop role-playing games. But today on Desks and Dorks, we are going to talk all about how you can make low fantasy warfare work in your games. Hello everybody, my name is Kyle Ott. I am the Dork. Welcome to Desks and Dorks. We make indie role-playing game content, generally speaking, with a historical bent. If you can hear the excitement in my voice, I am so excited to be returning to the world of low fantasy and talk about warfare. Before we get into that though, if you want to help support us and the work we do, our Patreon is here. For $10 a month, you get a unique game you can't get anywhere else, or for $3 a month, you get your name in the credits and early access to our content. You can also get PDFs of any of the role-playing games that we have made over at itch.io. Some of them are free, in fact, and if you're a member of the Desks and Dorks Discord, we're in the middle of doing a game jam right now. And if you want physical copies of any of our games, you can get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, or our partners over at Exalted Funeral. Now, let's talk about what we're going to discuss. Again, if you cannot tell the excitement in my voice, this is one of the longest, most researched videos that I have done in the channel in a hot minute. I love low fantasy. It is my favorite genre of game. I love it to pieces, and people love warfare within that. And again, that makes sense. There's a human story, a human element to the epic clashes of the past. However, with that said, I see a lot of folks implementing it either poorly or just flat out wrong in their games, and I thought I could lend a little bit of additional assistance and help making that nuance pop for your games. For those of you who don't know, I was trained as a medievalist. I have a medieval history degree, so this is something I'm absolutely stoked about. A couple things. One, I have framed this video because of its length into chapters, both in the timestamps in the description below and on title cards in the video so that you know when we are beginning a new section. Two, I have framed a lot of this over the things that people get wrong or mistaken about warfare and how warfare develops. I think that's really important, and it makes for an interesting way to frame the video. And lastly, I am not going to be indulging in stories about the gory details, both literally or figuratively, of battle. Please know that warfare in general, particularly in the Middle Ages and Antiquity, was a gruesome, gory affair. If you want to lean into those elements in your tabletop settings and games, I would highly encourage you to use some safety and communication tools, X cards, lines and veils, session zero, whatever, to really help those people. I am not going to be covering those things, not because they didn't happen and not because they're not important, but I am actually going to be leaning into the nitty-gritty of stuff like troop construction, army implementation, logistics, the stuff that gets overlooked but is really important and vital to how human beings have waged war and how we as tabletop role-playing game creators and players can enjoy it, or at least make it more interesting for the people at our table. With that out of the way, let's talk about Chapter 1, which is Common Misconceptions. These are the biggest offenders that I see people going through. If you want to start a game that it features warfare, this is the chapter I would like you to watch. You can come back to the video later on if you realize that you really like warfare, but if you're like, man, what part of the video am I going to watch to get the most bang for my buck? It's Chapter 1. And we're going to start with the biggest misconception, was that the weapons cause casualties. Now, pause for a second. I know I'm going to let a couple people be outraged. There's a little asterisk there for a reason. Weapons do cause casualties, right? And it makes sense, right? Look at these things. Horrific. You have things like the mace, the axe, the broadsword, or the Zweihander if you're from Germany. Things like the crossbow that were so bad that the Vatican actually attempted to ban them at certain points during the Middle Ages because they were such a problem. And you would be right in saying those things cause casualties. But I don't think that they caused as much as you think they do. That's the biggest common misconception, because while these weapons are deadly, these weapons are terrifying, they have nothing on the biggest culprits for how death and casualties happened during warfare. And the biggest one, no matter what source you look at, no matter what time period you're viewing or studying, is disease. Pestilence, disease, has the biggest impact on troop casualties and civilian casualties during times of warfare and political upheaval. And it's not close. Yes, you can do a lot of damage with an army, but you can do a whole lot more damage by forcing diseased people into a defended settlement and then letting that disease kind of take over. It happened several times, and it's a huge problem. And there's a number of different causes for disease. Right? We talk about things like trade and troop movement, for example. Trade is how we got stuff like the bubonic plague, but there's a lot of different factors that people often fail to take into account during times of warfare that make disease a foregone conclusion. Things like overcrowding in urban areas, for example. As war happens, people tend to flee to places where defenses are strongest. This can lead to overcrowding and problems with sanitation. Improper cure of injuries, or shall we say battlefield wounds, can also lead to disease within a person. And in fact, infection is one of the biggest causes of destruction during the Middle Ages and Antiquity. However, another thing that we don't take into account a lot is that as people move to newer areas, and I don't mean like a newer area like 10, 20 miles down the road, I mean a newer area like you have been forced from your homeland by the Mongols and have thus migrated about like 2,000 miles. That exposes people to new bacteria and new germs. It also means that diseases and bacteria that you have carried from your homeland into the new one reach a new populace. Again, for those of you who studied not just antiquity, but the age of discovery, quote unquote, I use the quotes there because they're doing a lot of heavy lifting. Smallpox, for example, is a devastating illness during this time. And of course, a lack of medicine and immediate treatment is another issue that plagues areas and people during times of warfare. These are all major considerations to take into account when you are talking about disease in the Middle Ages and Antiquity. But bad supplies also feature as a major issue during medieval and antiquity-based warfare. Look, one of the things that few folks tend to take into account is logistics. It is the thing that makes or breaks the success of armies, and one of the most logistically important resources is water. One of the things that comes up often in the reading that I do as somebody who was training to be a medievalist and who still loves the medieval history is the importance of water in places where water is scarce. One of the most tactically brilliant things, for example, that Salahuddin, the commander of Muslim forces in the Crusades, did was deprive Crusader armies of access to water, in some cases poisoning or destroying important water sources in the desert, thus forcing those Crusaders into situations where they're dropping of thirst before they even encounter a Saracen blade. This holds doubly true for times of guerrilla warfare, when insurgents or occupying forces would be looking for or attempting to destroy sources of viable and potable water for troops. And because not only did you need water in order to make sure that your infantry was okay, not only did you need water to do things like cooking, cleaning, and the treating of wounds, but you also needed water for horses, and those will come up much, much later, but those sons of guns drink way more than anybody expects. Losing access to water is one of the biggest causes of fatalities during the Middle Ages and Antiquity. It's also additionally true for food and food sources. If you're a fan of The Art of War, you should take a look at that book, by the way. It's a fantastic read. One of the things that comes up often in Sun Tzu's writing is the importance of keeping your army fed. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. This frankly horrifying looking picture of a butcher's shop does a good way of illustrating that you'll take food pretty much wherever you can get it. And smaller forces, for example, had the advantage of being able to forage. Foraging meant that they could gather resources from the wilderness, but larger armies had to bring those supplies in with them. Any problem with the supplies, food spoiling or going bad, food being destroyed or tainted by saboteurs, or food being stolen by desperate camp hangers-on, all of those things could not only hurt your morale, but also cripple your army's ability to fight. If you are going to look at warfare as a purely who can inflict the most casualties on another person style affair, disease and a lack of water and food are massive and massively more important than any weapons, tactical strategy, or nuance that you, I, or any human hand could ever create. And wise generals and tacticians often did everything in their power to deprive people of those resources and to ensure the conditions where disease would be a certainty. All of those things are important. And it leads me actually to one of the most interesting facts. I don't want to call it a fun fact, but it is an interesting fact. But during the medieval era, because of things like kosher food practices, Jewish communities or areas surrounding Jewish communities were actually less likely to get access to disease. Specifically, though, the bubonic plague. Part of it was a mixture of kosher laws. Part of it was the fact that a lot of times Jewish communities had been exiled to colder climates, where it was harder for the fleas carrying bubonic plague to live. Those two factors actually contributed to Jewish communities having a lower casualty rate during times of plague. It is also, unfortunately, one of the sources for the anti-Semitic myth that Jews engaged in disease magic, which, yes, that's a real thing. If you're interested in looking at a couple more sources, there's plenty of great scholarly papers, but I really enjoyed the book Matzah and Flour. That was pretty interesting as well. Less about the importance of climate and kosher practices in avoiding disease, and more about just the traditions of medieval Jewish communities, or just Jewish communities in general, I should say. So, an interesting read, but somebody asked, what kind of cool stuff are you looking at? This is a good example. And like I said, it's an interesting fact and an interesting thing to consider how these things, like dietary decisions and access to clean food, make a massive lasting impact, not just on culture and stories, but on warfare in general, or any time where there's a large number of people involved. But Kyle, I can hear you saying, surely the majority of casualties from weapons would have occurred during the battle itself, at least. And again, this is only partially true. You see, the idea of the bulk of casualties happening during the pitched conflict part of the battle is an exciting idea, right? We have things like the story of Henry V, the Battle of Agincourt, which is depicted right here. Or we have games like Battle Line, which are all about the warriors, the men-at-arms, the knights, and the people fighting, all working together in consort and falling all around one another as it happens. And yes, certainly casualties did occur during the pitched battle, but the truth of the matter is that the bulk of the casualties actually occur during a rout. Now, for those not in the know, a rout is the term for when an army's morale totally and completely breaks. They lose their will to fight, they turn around, and they flee. They are essentially run down by the attacking force or the winning force, who then basically just is able to destroy them completely. This is where the bulk of casualties actually occurred. Now, again, did people go down and suffer casualties, wounds, being destroyed during actual fighting? Of course they did. People got unalived because they caught the business end of a battle axe all the time. That totally happens. But the bulk of casualties, the thing that a lot of folks get wrong, the bulk happens when the army's will breaks and they turn tail and run. Now, you might be wondering how this works, but by the way, Medieval Total War, Medieval 2, Total War, gets this so completely right, by the way. Actually, the Total War series in general, up until Warhammer, gets the idea of routing so completely right. It's one of the criticisms that I see new players lob at the game all the time, is they're like, once my guys retreat, they basically always get destroyed. Yes, that is basically what happened. It's part of the reason, too, that cavalry took on such great importance during the Middle Ages, or it also speaks to the importance of cavalry in antiquity, where it wasn't used so much as shock troops, but to run down opposing fleeing enemies, or to harry and flank fleeing enemies so that they could be captured or destroyed later. One of the greatest examples of the savagery and the casualties inflicted during a rout comes from our understanding of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where Harold Godwinson's heavily armored infantry were finally broken. Holes opened up in the line from the Norman cavalry. Those holes were then exploited, and with them being completely surrounded, or in danger of being completely surrounded, the Huscarls broke ranks, ran, and were basically summarily destroyed by the invading Norman forces. Now, we know this from first-hand accounts of the battle, both from Norman and Saxon sources, but if you don't believe those, you can actually see it in the Bayeux Tapestry as well. This scene from the Bayeux Tapestry depicts the Norman cavalry essentially charging into the lines, and then eventually breaking those lines, riding through them, and running down the Saxon Huscarls. It's a really terrifying thing. But pieces like this and stories of battles like the Battle of Hastings go a long way to illustrating the importance of the rout and morale in low fantasy warfare. If you're going to be waging battle, yes, you need to think about things like supplies, disease, water, and food, but you cannot neglect the mental strength and fortitude of the soldiers that you're fighting with. And this actually leads into another big misconception, which is the idea that battles were vastly dynamic affairs, a push and pull, a back and forth, and certainly that did occur in the battle lines themselves. However, it's pretty rare that once an army truly routed, they ever really came back from this. You had things like false routes or false retreats, certainly, but the idea that battles were like really dynamic affairs, the kinds that you see in Hollywood movies, is again a Hollywood misconception. And you know, it's cool to think about, right? Human beings in general love the idea of push and pull, the tug of war match of epic proportions going across the battlefield, but really again, you can thank Hollywood for this misconception. Films like Chronicles of Narnia, by the way, does this really well or really poorly, I suppose, depending on how you're looking at this. This scene, for example, from Prince Caspian is a great example of like what should have been a pretty slam dunk win for the bad guys for reasons that we will talk about a little bit later. But the idea of this sort of push-pull battle when really, you know, once your morale broke, you were pretty much cooked, is entirely there for entertainment value and for, you know, the thrill of the game itself. As a sidebar, by the way, why is it that the warriors from Prince Caspian had all of the drip imaginable? Look at this. This goes stupid hard. Why is it the bad guys get all the cool armor? I also can't be the only one that is obsessed with those double catapults where it throws one stone and then uses the momentum to pick up a second stone and throw it. Again, goes hard. Yes, I know it's ahistorical. Still dope. Moving on. And actually, I really was excited that we get to talk about that scene from Prince Caspian because it lets me bring up Roel Kaniadek, who is a historian at the University of Oxford who features and specializes in ancient warfare. Now, some of you, if you are savvy internet consumers of content, probably know this guy from the Insider video series where he rates scenes from movies and popular television shows. He is lovingly, or perhaps not so lovingly, known as Trench and Ditch Guy. One of the things that he talks about all of the time is if you're in a clearly indefensible position, you should be digging as many ditches and trenches. You should be making as many fortifications as possible. The reason I showed you that slide from Prince Caspian is you'll notice the defenders basically are just sitting there ready to get overwhelmed and destroyed by a larger, numerically superior force. And this actually does feature in both warfare in antiquity and in warfare in the Middle Ages. The idea that battles are dynamic is stymied by the fact that in many cases, like engaging forces, whether you're the attacker or the defender, you would oftentimes try to create embankments, trenches, ditches, walls, watchtowers, all manner of things to protect yourself if you could dig in, particularly if you were in enemy territory or against a numerically superior force. That was the best thing to do. Why not have the enemy throw themselves at the high ground and at the defenses that you have, rather than waste precious time, energy, and the soldiers that you brought with you losing to those people? I think that matters. And another reason that I wanted to bring this up is that this type of defense goes into the construction of medieval towns in the future. These battle ditches, for example, this is a lovely little map of the town of Chipping, feature prominently in not only the development of the architecture and the area of towns like it, but featured and played a role in how those towns grew and changed into the later Middle Ages and Renaissance. Not only were these super important, and not only did these completely and totally alter the flow of battle, making it a far less dynamic affair, but they played massive roles in how places grew and changed beyond the time that they were constructed. Also, not part of the video, look at that adorable little hedgehog in the bottom left-hand corner. Of course I'm going to put this into the video. Another thing to take into account, by the way, and I'm going to go back for just 1 second to show you this image one more time, but this type of a construction would have been fairly common during the time of the Roman Empire. We don't take it into account enough, I think, that the Roman legion's greatest strength was its logistical might. Roman legionaries were required by military law, post-Marian reforms, to carry with them the tools needed to essentially be top-tier carpenters. We have numerous accounts of Roman enemies going to sleep and then waking up and finding defenses like this erected basically overnight. Julius Caesar did this famously against Vercingetorix in his Gallic campaigns, where Vercingetorix goes to bed one night in his fortress, surrounded by another fortress the next morning. It goes absolutely hard. And again, it plays a role in pointing things out about how and why battles were not as dynamic as we might think. Now let's talk about Chapter 2. This is a general development of warfare, because I think if you lack a certain level of training, it can feel like a lot of military developments kind of fall out of the sky, but it's really important for us, at least for our purposes as game masters and perhaps junior or enthusiast medievalists, to consider that warfare develops kind of like a good sea shanty. Now, what do I mean by that? It's all about call and response. You are presented with a problem, and then you solve it. So a great example of this is the development of warfare in antiquity, particularly in the Greek Etruscan city-states. So one of the things that will happen is warfare and standing armies don't necessarily get used all that often in those early periods of the early Etruscan and early Greek city-state time. What you had was people who were usually top-tier citizens in the place that you lived, so like the wealthiest, the most powerful, those who could afford armor, would usually gather outside of a city-state to solve a particular problem. And what happened was essentially posturing. You would usually have a couple skirmishers. They would be throwing javelins or like lobbing hand axes, using slings, essentially just going after each other. One side would suffer a couple casualties, that would be enough so that honor was satisfied, and then everyone would go home. This changed when several of the Greek city-states and Etruscan city-states realized, we're not really solving anything, and we keep having to fight these mostly cosmetic battles for political reasons. Why don't we just actually take the fight to the enemy? And over time, that bronze armor changed and grew and developed. They realized you didn't need to totally kit out a couple warriors in bronze. You could give a bronze cuirass, a bronze shield, and a bronze helmet to a couple warriors in certain positions, have them cover for one another, and then be able to move forward as effectively or even more effectively than if you heavily armored a group of smaller citizens. This led to the formation of the phalanx, and with it, Greek and Etruscan warfare, actually warfare just in the Mediterranean and Anatolia in general, went from the kind of posturing that we're talking about. Again, that's the call. This is the response. All of a sudden, you are cooked, my boy, if you show up with just a bunch of skirmishers. The Greek phalanx was famously effective against ranged combatants, and you would be crushed if that's what you brought. This innovation forced everybody in the area to adopt that innovation. So again, that's the call. The call was, we had the sort of ranged posturing. Now we have the response of, it's the arrival of the phalanx. And again, just as warfare continues to develop, the phalanx itself becomes the call. So what's the response to that? Well, the response to that is the Roman maniple. The Roman maniple, again, this is the one pre-Marian reforms, but the Roman maniple basically says, hey, we need to be able to adapt to harsh climates and to rugged terrain. One of the phalanx's biggest weaknesses is that in mountainous terrain or rugged, uneven terrain, it is hard to keep your battle line, and that is when the weaknesses in the armor and the way that the warriors in a phalanx are set up start to show. So the Roman manipular formation arises. It is essentially breaking down people based on their, in this case, their class status, but giving them equipment based on the job that they need to perform, and allowing for the flexibility within a unit to swap back and forth between those different types of soldiers as the situation arises. This is an interesting concept, and it allows them the flexibility and adaptability to engage phalanx-style enemies on rugged or uneven terrain. Something to take note of is that the Romans actually fought like the Greek city-states for much of their early history. They fought like phalanxes, they fought like Greeks and Etruscans. They didn't fight like Romans until much later, after the city-state had already developed and was becoming into a nascent empire, essentially. So again, call and response. So What's the call and response after that? As Rome's imperial ambition grows, I wonder what happens and how it develops. Well, we go from the pre-Marian reforms to the post-Marian reforms, because one of the big issues that they found was a lack of standardization both in training and equipment meant that armies could not be counted on, at least consistently, to do the jobs needed for the Roman machine to continue to grow and expand. And the Marian legions fixed that. You had standardized equipment, standardized issues of organization and regimentation, standardized training, standardized pay. And on top of that, you combined that with a top-tier understanding of manipular tactics. It was important. So, what's the response? Well, Rome eventually falls. This empire is essentially a victim of its own success and its own excess. So, Rome falls. It's harder to mass produce those things. And as a result, over time, smaller, well-armed elite warbands start to grow. There's a number of different tactical things that go along with this. The reason, for example, that knights are so effective in the Middle Ages is developments in the saddle and stirrups, which did not exist during the Bronze Age, start to come to being. The idea of moving from bronze to steel means that you have essentially a renaissance in armor creation, which means that much more heavily armed individuals are far more effective in the Middle Ages than they would have been in the Bronze Age. But also, a huge issue is the logistics. It's harder to feed, house, and make a larger army post-fall of Rome. It's why we get smaller, more well-armed warbands, essentially a step up and a step above what we started with. Again, call and response. Now, we're going to talk a little bit now about siege and defense. I think this is really important. Now, we talked again about digging trenches and digging ditches in battle, but if you're like me and the Fisher-Price Castle had you in the world's biggest chokehold, chances are when I say defense, you are thinking about a good old proper siege, right? The kind that had this sort of toy, which, by the way, look at the left-hand side. I did not realize that there was a quadruple boulder launcher cannon. When did that happen and why did I miss it? But again, moving forward, things that, like, in your mind had a scene like this looking kind of like Helm's Deep, right? You're thinking of sieges, and there's a lot that people tend to get wrong when it comes to a good old-fashioned siege, because they don't tend to look like Helm's Deep. They tend to look kind of like this, but this is actually an architectural wonder, and I'm gonna explain why. You see, the castle is a feat of architectural wonder. It is a nuanced, incredible creation that is scientifically designed to make you, yes you, as miserable as possible if you tried to take it. Things like the roof was angled to prevent things like fire from taking or destroying it. Arrow slits in the castle walls were designed to do basically several things. One, to give attackers no chance of shooting through the arrow slit, to give defenders perfect cover while still being able to shoot through the arrow slit, and they were designed so they didn't compromise the strength of the stone walls at all. Holes in the floor meant that you could essentially shoot from, like, hiding on enemies below you, which was absolutely insane. And by the way, the merlons, which are, by the way, what we refer to as those little sections on the top of the parapets, or the battlements, were essentially designed so that it was easier for you to take cover, get a shot, and then go back into cover. Every part of the castle is designed to make your life absolutely miserable. Not only that, but they were designed in such a way that height variance meant that if you took one section of the castle, good for you. Castles were usually arrayed in such a way that you would have to continually take certain sections. The enemy would always have the high ground. Even on the walls or the parapets themselves, height tended to fluctuate, which means you weren't even safe on the same section of wall that you took. Also, that doesn't even take into account what happens if somebody who is a mad lad decides that they're going to erect a castle in a place with natural defenses. If that's the case, buddy, you are cooked, my boy. Cooked. It is unbelievable how hard it was to take a castle at multiple points during the Middle Ages and medieval history. You were better off trying to catch lightning in some cases. And because of this, The majority of the sieges were either lifted, which means that the enemy either just gave up because the war ended, they ran out of supplies, or an allied army showed up to relieve them of the siege, or the people inside had to surrender because they were running out of supplies. This means that as cool as moments like Helm's Deep are, those types of battles where an army took a castle by force rarely, if ever, happen. Yes, I know that that's like a huge, sad thing. Usually you were better off just going around the castle or laying waste to the surrounding countryside than you were if you took the castle. You would have to have numerical superiority, and in some cases technological superiority, of great amounts in order to successfully take a castle. And even if you could, chances are you probably didn't want to destroy the castle. Castles, because of the amount of architectural skill needed, the amount of supplies, particularly stone, that had to be quarried for a castle's construction, and the expertise and manpower hours that it took to create one of these things, meant that even if you did take a castle, destroying it would have been tactically unadvisable at best and downright stupid at worst, because they are a resource. Think of castles not just as places to defend yourself, places to rule out of, but as things like distribution centers, community centers, logistical standpoints, warehouses, or rallying points during points of warfare. A castle literally increases your ability to govern a kingdom effectively. It is not just a fortress, it is a supply depot. It is a reminder to the people that you have the power. It is a place for you to gather forces without fear of retribution, and again, it's a great place to collect taxes, resources, or again, to gather individuals that you need. There's a reason, for example, that I have included this map of France. Those red dots are castles, and you'll notice they are scattered around the country, making it easier for you to actually gather. And this map, by the way, is out of date. These are castles that exist in France now, in the modern era. During the Middle Ages, this was way more, because a castle isn't just an incredible defensive structure. It is an important part of governance and logistics within the realm. Even if you could take it, you were better off leaving it up so that you could use it. They are essential to the governing of a kingdom, and even more essential to our understanding of medieval warfare. And now we get to talk about logistics. Logistics, my beloved. The often overlooked child of medieval warfare. The all-important thing by which victory is won. Even if you had the most valiant warriors, the greatest tacticians, the best arms and armor, if your logistics were bad, you were going to lose. That's not just conjecture. That is a military fact that pops up in every empire, in every culture, in every part of human history, across time. And man, is it true for the low fantasy settings. Whether we are talking about the condottieri of Italy, whether we're talking about the soldiers of the 100 Years' War, the men-at-arms, the warrior bishops of Germany, or any number of soldiers, payment and employment are often the hardest things for someone to do. And one of the biggest things that you got for paying your soldiers was looting. You were expected, if you were a commander, and this is true, by the way, even in antiquity, if you were a commander, you were expected to allow your soldiers to take part in the looting of a destroyed city. This means that part of the way that you paid people was in the goods, the equipment, and sometimes, unfortunately, the people that they would take from those cities. It was a bulk of the way that you paid your fighting forces, not just in the Middle Ages, but in antiquity as well. If you are planning on making a low fantasy game, you desperately need to have some amount of looting be a huge focus, and that's just an unfortunate side effect of how it really, truly goes. But not just looting of regular common folk. How about ransom culture as well? Taking a well-to-do person, a duke, a baron, an important knight, and ransoming them back to their home country was how a lot of soldiers got a vast portion of their wealth, and the right captive at the right time could turn you from an upstart mercenary into a member of the landed gentry overnight. Some individuals, however, got their payment from, shall we say, governmental figures like kings. A knight's payment was essentially deducted from the work and labor of their fief. All of those things go into the importance of logistics as a way of paying your forces. But let's say you're setting up a campaign. Let's say you want to take your knights on the road. What are your biggest expenses? And I'm so happy you asked. One of the biggest ones is transportation. Depending on when or what time period you're basing your low fantasy role-playing game on, transportation is going to be a beast. During antiquity, at certain points, it's very difficult. It's easier over land and sea during Rome and Greece's Golden Age. That's just how it works. The Romans maintained roads, the Greeks maintained a well-to-do and very well-protected maritime shipping routes. That made travel much easier. It's true, by the way, for the Macedonian conquests of Alexander. He did a pretty good job of keeping those maritime shipping lanes safe. And actually, by him, I mean Ptolemy. However, another major expense are these goobers. I hate horses, by the way. This is like a small confession. I have ridden on an elephant. I have ridden on a camel. I have never ridden a horse, and I don't know why I don't trust them. I really don't. I think maybe I'm a dwarf. I live in a dark place, and I drink beer, and I lift heavy objects. I don't trust horses, all right? Gimli was right. But the important thing about them is that they eat and drink so much. Part of the difficulty in maintaining a large amount of high-quality cavalry during the Middle Ages and Antiquity is the sheer amount that horses consume. And it's not like you can just give them anything, right? Like, you could theoretically feed like dogs or other pack animals basically just scraps of whatever it is that you eat. You can't do that with horses. You just can't. And logistically speaking, they are nightmares to feed, water, and transport. They're also really hard to take care of when they're sick. Fun fact about horses, their legs and hooves don't function like legs, they function like big fingers, essentially, where there's not a lot of musculature to protect the leg itself. It's basically just tendons attached to bone. That's crazy work, and it means that a horse injured in battle is a massive expense if you want to keep them alive, and a massive amount of dead weight if you want to keep them fed while they're injured during a time of warfare. And lastly, food for your soldiers is one of the biggest, if not the biggest expense you could have as a military. It is especially hard in low fantasy areas of games where there isn't access to refrigeration. We often forget how much refrigeration and preservatives have shifted the cultural and historical landscape of the world, but without access to those things, long marches are exceptionally dangerous because of our good friend disease that we talked about at the beginning of the video. Foodborne illnesses are a problem, and making sure that you have access to enough fresh ingredients or to expensive preserved ingredients at this time to keep your soldiers fed and healthy is an exorbitant expense. A tactician, a general, a leader who ignores those things, or somebody who is designing a fantasy role-playing game setting based on the real world who ignores those things loses out on a ton of nuance and on the importance of logistics, which again, I cannot stress this enough. It was important enough that Sun Tzu talked about it, Alexander the Great talks about it, Hannibal Barca talks about it, Scipio Africanus talk about it. Every major military commander in the world, Napoleon talks about it. Every major military commander in history talks about the importance of logistics, and they're all right. Do not leave this out when you are including warfare in your settings. It is crucial. Absolutely crucial. Now that we've talked about the costs, we've talked about the misconceptions, we've talked a little bit about how battle was waged, how sieges would have been waged, let's talk about army composition, because I think it matters. Now, specifically, we've talked a little bit about the army composition of antiquity, but we're going to be talking a lot about the army composition of the medieval ages. But first, I do want to talk about Rome one more time. One of the things that often gets glossed over, both for Rome, for Greece, for the Etruscans, and in some cases for the Egyptians as well, is the importance of mercenaries. One of the things that happens in antiquity is empires usually tended to focus on specific things, right? Greece focuses on its infantry, Carthage, its navy, Rome, its infantry as well, just in a different way than the Greeks did. And so for a lot of those histories, they will take and rent out, essentially, warriors from other cultures and other time periods. If you look at the bottom, by the way, what you're going to notice is like a Numidian skirmisher, a Celtic warrior, Syrian archers. The Romans were so guilty of using basically anybody from different cultures and time periods to help them and shore up weaknesses in their own military. It's actually so important to think about, like, that it winds up biting Rome in the end. Like, Alaric the Visigoth, who sacks Rome, the guy, who conquers Rome, isn't just some random barbarian. He is legitimately a former Roman soldier. He was an auxiliary. So very important to think about, but I want to talk a little bit more about how like other armies would have worked. This is obviously from the Napoleonic era, but one of the things to take into account, because this happens even during the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have been called coalitions, probably would have just been called alliances, is because it is so difficult at certain times in human history to organize vast swaths of soldiers. What you will have is these massive mosaic alliances where individual leaders, fiefs, kingdoms, dukes, whatever, even towns, for example, like you have towns and cities working together. The Swabian League works a little bit like that, but you have basically any organizational or governmental force can form a coalition, and this oftentimes matters in terms of army composition, because what happens is you need multiple governmental entities in order to essentially bear the costs of running, maintaining, and fielding armies of that size. Again, I know this is from the Napoleonic era, but A, it's interesting, and B, coalitions like this are essentially the descendants of the alliances that exist in the Middle Ages due to cost and due to army maintenance. It's something for you to take into account. Even a great king might not be able to field a vast swath of soldiers, but they might be able to count on other kings, knights, and vassals to help them basically field an army of any real size or merit. Very, very important. One last thing, if you're going to do any additional research on the foundation of modern European militaries, we have to talk a little bit about Gustavo Adolphus, who is the king of Sweden. He is often called the Lion of the North, which is just a great nickname, but he is largely responsible for organizing his force into what becomes the precursor for modern European militaries. It's what takes us out of the Renaissance and into the early modern period. His reforms, things like how he organized his officer corps, how he treated battles, his use of multi-pronged attacks, things that featured both artillery, melee, and ranged combatants, is massive. It is really hard, at least when we're talking about Western Europe, to overstate Gustavo Adolphus's importance in shaping how multifaceted armies would become in the modern era. Again, an important thing for your future research if you want a little bit more about this. I didn't include it because now we're getting into the technology side of things, but his influence, his impact, his reforms are critical if we're talking about troop and army maintenance and composition. However, if you need a TLDR, it's this. Empires and governmental units tended to specialize, and they tended to farm out as needed, and if you're going to field a massive force, you have to rely on alliances and coalition building in order to do so. It is just the nature of the beast when we get into larger armies during the Middle Ages. It's not true in antiquity. Rome, Persia, Macedon, Egypt, or Macedon, I should say. I don't know why I said Macedon. Macedon, all of them field massive armies on their own. But when you get into the low fantasy, the Dungeons and Dragons style of like medieval living, that you had to rely on coalition building. There was no other option to field those kinds of armies. No individual unit tended to have the kind of resources necessary to field the armies that you and I would see in something like a Hollywood blockbuster. And finally, we get to talk about how to use these concepts in our games. To start though, I want to go over why I think some game masters are afraid of using the military or using large-scale warfare in their games. And issue one is too much upkeep, right? Part of what is difficult, particularly if you're playing a game with a lot of combat, is keeping track of those combatants. It's a lot of upkeep on the game master side of things, particularly if you're playing in a physical tabletop. It gets a little easier if you are on digital tabletops, stuff like Roll20, but again, I think that's kind of a cop-out, and even then it's still really, really, really difficult. Another issue is, how do you keep the scope but also retain the agency? I like to call this the Dynasty Warriors problem, which is a perfectly serviceable video game, but oftentimes I've found that I don't feel as much like a hero, and I also don't feel much like I'm leading an army or taking part in large-scale troop-based maneuvers. It just tends to feel like a ho-hum kind of hacking experience. And I think part of it is I lose the scope and nuance of the massive amount of soldiers, but I also lose the importance of my own personal journey as a character. And so that issue comes up quite a lot if you're going to run it. And another one is, how do you keep the role-playing part of your role-playing game together when the entire backdrop is based on the fight? Now, again, there are people who thrive in combat-based experiences. I am not one of them, at least not for my role-playing games. Still love me some Gloomhaven. Still absolutely love me some skirmish games. Shout out to Trench Crusade. But like, I don't come to a role-playing game for that experience. So how do you get the core feeling of combat without losing both the agency, the role-playing, and without taking too much upkeep on yourself? I think that's important. I'm going to give a shout-out before I start talking about how I do it to Eat the Reich, which is a phenomenal game by Rowan, Rook, and Deckard. But they essentially treat soldiers like mooks. Anyone who's like an unnamed or unpowered soldier basically is like one wound, and it means that you can throw tons of people at the enemy or at the players, and they feel really powerful taking them down, but it doesn't mean that you get bogged down really often, because a lot of times they're just cannon fodder, which is fitting given the enemies of that game are willing to throw lives away like they're meaningless solely for the purpose of trying to achieve their goals. It fits both thematically, but it also is a really interesting way of approaching that as a system. I don't think it works for us, but I do think I wanted to bring it up now because I thought it was neat. I liked the way that they handled it. I thought it was cool. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about how to approach the wonders of battle in our games. And the first one is, I think you really need to lean into the preparation angle, the way that soldiers and warriors will approach combat, and you really need to let your players have an active role in prepping for battle. We talked at length about the importance of defenses, but have your players do the defense planning themselves. Let them sketch on your battle map, or if you're playing Roll20, give them the ability to actually draw on whatever map that you have prepared. Create clear rules for how their fortifications are going to work, right? Whether it's they have enemy movement or they can collapse a tunnel, but like, give your players the agency to prepare their defenses and then let the enemy come at them in those defenses. It's a really cool way to do it. I have done this multiple times where I've had essentially an impromptu siege for my players, and every single time, without fail, it goes off beautifully because the players are engaged in creating unique and creative defenses and figuring out how they want to do this. I've had 12-year-olds figure out, oh, we're way outnumbered and we don't have enough supplies to protect the whole area. Why don't we just funnel them all into one location? And then they did, and then just nailed things with ranged spells and just ranged attacks. It was beautiful, but they'd essentially figured out an age-old antiquity level tactic without me having to instruct or inform them on anything. But you trust that your players can have that agency. Give them the chance to prepare the defenses naturally. And speaking of preparing, why not give them the opportunity to do a heroic speech, right? This does happen, by the way, not just in the Total War series, but in real life. Alexander the Great at one point literally strips naked in front of his army and gives them a guided tour, essentially, of every scar on his body, where he got the scar and what weapon he gives it from. Hannibal Barca famously, and this is an apocryphal story, we don't know if this is true necessarily, but we have multiple accounts of Hannibal essentially bringing 2 prisoners and to fight to the death, basically not like at first the troops are like, why are you having us do this? And they're outside of one of the Roman cities. I think it was Mediolanum, I think is what they were in front of. I'm not sure if I'm correct on that. But essentially, after the fight is over, he goes, you are these prisoners right now. Either you will die and be granted the eternal freedom of death, or you will succeed and grant glory and riches like you have never seen. And he proceeds to shower the prisoner that survived in gold and his freedom, right? It was a huge moment. So these do happen. Give your players the chance to do a heroic speech and have it give some bonuses. But for the love of all that's good and holy, if you give them flat bonuses for a badass, like Kingdom of Heaven style speech, I will eat your shoes. I will find you personally and I will eat your shoes unseasoned. I'm not even joking. I'll live in your walls for a little bit. I'll make it happen. Don't do this. That's so boring. Don't do that, right? Instead, why not give them access to a lesser version of a character's signature move? Why not give them temporary hit points equal to your player's hit points? Why not give them new abilities that are based on the experiences that those troops have had fighting alongside the characters in the game? All of these are really cool things, but make them temporary, make them last only for that battle. Call it an inspiration bonus, call it a destiny bonus, call it whatever you want, but give your players the chance to rally warriors to their cause in character. It's such a cool moment, and especially if you have a character or a player who's really role-playing focused. I've done this a couple times, they always run with it, and it's such a cool way to approach this system. It's so good. And another thing that I think is just helpful in terms, this is not like a groundbreaking or exciting rule, but it's something that I think is interesting. It's something I took from Warhammer Fantasy, is you can treat units as individuals. And what I mean by that is just, cordon off a section of the map and be like, this is a unit, and have that unit act as an individual. So like they all move together, they all fight together, they all, engage in combat together. Bonus points if you have the old square character trays from Warhammer. Those worked beautifully. I have used those a couple of times. In addition, if you don't have access to those, but you have somebody who plays A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniature skirmish game, those trays work pretty well too, and they're circular based, which is kind of neat. So, just two things you could potentially use for your own table. Again, and then just have them either march in columns or in orders, have them turn based on a square, and you can treat them as background, right? Like players can't go through a unit or something like that. But I would say have the players be unable to damage them, have a certain amount of damage though cause that unit to break rank and flee. Again, you want to be playing up the importance of morale in the game that you've got and how it matters in your games. And with that, my friends, we are done with the video. Some of you, however, probably have noticed that I have conspicuously left out magic. At the time of this recording, I have gone through probably about 2 hours, 3 hours worth of footage, not counting the research for just this video. That's also not counting the Q&A section, which will be coming very soon. So approaching the way that magic would work in a low fantasy battle is a whole different beast. And that's even more if we want to approach high fantasy. So if you want to see how I would approach magic in a large scale warfare setting, get this video to 400 likes. That will be my way of knowing you all want to see that content. Because I'm gonna be real with you, like I said, we're like 3 hours of footage in, not counting the research, not counting the Q&A at this point in the video. Like if I do magic, I'm gonna be here till the end of time. So let me know if that's something you want, but you gotta let me know through the liking. That's the only way that works. Deal? Deal. I'm just going to assume that you said deal rhetorically. I think that's fair. If you want to support this kind of content, if you like this kind of content, again, Patreon, $3 a month or $10 a month. It's pretty affordable. It's pretty great if you want some unique role-playing games. If you want unique role-playing games, however, and you want already published ones that you'll own forever, why not get PDFs over at itch.io? And if you want physical ones, go to Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, or our partners over at Exalted Funeral. Go to their websites. You can search Desks and Dorks. They will absolutely hook you up with some phenomenal role-playing games. However, before we go to the Q&A section, I have to thank my amazing patrons, Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, and Papa Dinosaur. Y'all are absolutely amazing. Thank y'all so much for the support. Now, again, there's a Q&A section that follows this video. If you're a member of the Desks and Discord, which you can join for free, the link is also in the description below. It's where you ask the questions for me, stuff that maybe didn't get its own section here, and that's what's going to happen now. Hopefully you will stick around and join us for that. I am very excited. I imagine it's going to be an exciting conversation. But if this is where we part ways, I am Kyle for Desks and Dorks. You are all absolutely amazing. Please get this to 400 likes, because I actually really want to make the follow-up to it, but I want to know that the time and effort is going to be commensurate with what you guys want. So, that's your challenge. I'm still Kyle for Desks and Dorks. You've still been amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. How are we doing, homies? Man, it's good to see you all. Okay, so crack open a beverage of your choice. I think it is very important for us to talk about this. Let's go. Let's have a conversation about all the fun things. Okay, first question, Ignacio. What's up, Ignacio? Low fantasy warfare. Imagine a world in which low fantasy, because mages are 1 in a million, devastating spells but only medium range. How would armies work around the mage to protect it and get them to the range they can dish out damage? So without getting too far, Ignacio, into what will be, I hope, maybe when this gets to 400 likes, the way that we approach magical warfare in a low fantasy world, I imagine it would play out very much like artillery, where there's a lot of protection. I think that's kind of an important thing. GJ Sleepy Time. What kind of countermeasures could normal humans employ in the face of larger threats like orcs, ogres, or giants? That's actually a really good one, because we know what that's like, right? Cavalry is a larger threat, and in a lot of cases, the humble spear, DJ Sleepy Time, is one of the best weapons for this. Ranged combat as well. One of the reasons the Vatican actually tries to ban the crossbow during the Middle Ages is of how effective it was against knights, and they're like, no, can't have that. But yes, ranged weapons and anything that keeps an enemy like that at a distance, but particularly the spear, which will later become the pike, and then of course any sort of ranged weapon that's able to puncture armor or make armor very difficult to engage with. So that's a good one. Wood towns only exist as walled settlements, slowing expansion and resource gain in exchange for safety. I think this is just in general to larger threats. Yeah, for the most part, but that I think is true DJ Sleepy Time in general, right? Like, part of the reason that you have a slower growth of civilization in the Middle Ages is that total breakdown of bureaucratic systems and governance. And that means that it's really difficult for people to sort of spread their ideas, to spread around. So yeah, people did tend to stick to walled settlements for a very long time. So, and what social impact would occur if magic users were scooped up by governments or kings to monopolize on their abilities? With that said, I am not going to answer that question. I know I'm being coy here, and I'm trying really hard not to be. But there's some larger implications, and I want to give it a full video. So tell you what, I'm going to screenshot this on the old Thoneroony. I'm screenshotting yours too, Ignacio, and then that way I will be able to come back for those. Oh, by the way, if you're new and you're watching this for the first time and you're wondering why this is not edited and why this feels more conversational, this is the Q&A section. That's kind of what I do. This is my reward for a video well recorded. It's a much more low-key section of the video. So welcome if you're here. So Luxodon Prince, how would the implication of low fantasy influence logistical support crews or camp followers? Do you think warfare in this world would begin the move towards larger professional armies sooner? Yes. And the reason I think that, right, is if you have larger professional armies, like let's just take racial or special bonuses into account. Like, let's just assume this is like D&D, right? We'll just assume that. One of the things that you would have is you've got people who are just naturally better at certain things, like half elves being able to like get insight bonuses just by being around areas where they potentially could, or elves not needing to sleep makes them the perfect watchmen and scouts. Dwarves, because they're able to sort of construct these things that are immune to poison, are fantastic at maintaining the logistical lines that keep everything going. I think you move to a modern army way faster, and I think that's true in any setting where there's some level of difference between the races of the world. I think that's massively important. And would those be supplemented by fantastical mercenaries and vassals? Yes. Do I think manipular tactics still have a prevailing influence in small unit cohesions in these kinds of settings? Abso-freaking-lutely. And Loxodon, I'm glad that you brought this up, because one of the things that I think is really critical is and I didn't mention this in army composition, I'm realizing I should have, is during the Middle Ages and the late Bronze Age, the importance of warbands, or the early Bronze Age, the importance of warbands, and those warbands generally tended to act like manipular units anyway. So, kind of an important thing there. And then Big Trebuchet, just put tendrils and floating disc. Yes, Big Trebuchet. Big Trebuchet is the name of my Dave Matthews cover band. All right, the Adjudicator. Were there any historical instances where castles, fortresses, and walls were breached during a siege and the defenders were still able to defeat the attackers? Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't know. We have ones where the gatehouse was breached in pitched battle, and then the area fell. Oh, that's not true. Yes. No, actually, no. Now that I'm thinking about this Adjudicator, yeah, there's numerous ones. Like Mott and Bailey's, there's a couple keeps during the Crusades. There's a bunch of, fortifications during the 100 Years' War where, they would take the gatehouse and then they get forced out, then retake the gatehouse, then get forced out. So, yeah, it happens actually more often than not. Now, if it's a total breach, if the city is close to falling, at that point, do people get forced out? Not unless there's, an incredible Hail Mary moment for that force. No, that does not happen. So, were gatehouse mechanisms ever tampered with to gain access to a fortress to help win a siege? Yeah, essentially. And I don't know about tampered with, but opened from the inside happened a couple times. Obviously, if you tamper with the mechanism, it doesn't really open, and that kind of defeats the purpose of that. But yeah, opened, absolutely. The gate's literally thrown open. Carl, that kills people. In your opinion, how do you think civilization would develop in the presence of high-powered predators? E.g., farming would be an issue if griffins kept snacking on people working on the fields. Again, I think a lot of this, Carl, you can trace to how farming develops and changes as a result of stuff like banditry, or the constant interscene political conflict, right? It tanks. It goes much smaller scale. Communities tend to become a lot more insular. I'm thinking directly after the Bronze Age collapse and the early Middle Ages. So, yeah, I think it might be a good way. Cybrandir. I hope I'm saying that right, Cybrandir. This may be a grim thing to think about, but what about death? I feel like a lot of campaigns, the players, unalive a lot of entities, and with lower population and population density in the Middle Ages, that is bound to disrupt the ways of living. Like a very localized 30 Years' War. Ooh, that is such a good question. And Sabrander, I think you're right. If you're going to lean into it, right, I think that's such a cool way to illustrate the impact the players have. If the players, take out the town blacksmith in a skirmish, and then later on come to that town and they're like, I need my gear repaired, or my horse is lame and there's a nail in it, in their shoe, that's wrong. They're just hosed. Having them lose access to those services and that part of life is, I think, a huge way of playing up that consequence. That's probably how I would do it. It's how I've done it in the past, where I've been the little things that you are taking into account or not taking into account, you lose access to those. I find, Sabrander, that the way that you get buy-in from players for emotional moments isn't in the big things, it's in the little ones. It's having those small creature comforts, or that conversation with an NPC every time you come into town, or the knowledge that something is safe. Having that taken away often, I think, has a more profound impact on players than not. That would be my recommendation. Because I think you're right. Like in smaller communities like that, man, that is such a critical thing. McGeel asked, is there a historical basis for the Sorcerer King archetype? Kind of. McGeel, we have access to like court alchemists, court wizards all the time. Like not all the time, but in places like the Holy Roman Empire or in Italy. And so, yeah, like there is like the basis of like somebody with quote unquote magical or arcane power, quote unquote, being utilized in the real world. So I don't know if that's necessarily a total inspiration, but the idea of like power granting you proximity to governmental power, I think is something that's pretty long-standing in history. Speaking of Sorcerer Kings, what might consequences be when factions' most powerful military assets are more interested in throne rooms and brothels than battlefields? You basically get the mercenaries of the 100 Years' War and Flanders. real talk. There's a large amount of a budget in a middle-age army that should be going to keeping your men fed, but sometimes just goes to keeping your men kind of lit. Real talk. Just like you're trying to get them going like that, basically. Because in a lot of cases, and I don't know if this is we're entering into the conjecture zone. But I think about it all the time. But like warfare in antiquity, warfare in the Middle Ages is horrific. How much of that is like literally just PTSD driven is a really big question in my mind, right? So I'm thinking, man, I'm gonna be real. I think a lot of it is just, I think there's a benefit in keeping them in bars and brothels, rather than in the throne room or in battlefields. Okay, 3 peasant levies have been called to arms. What folk magic are the poor grunts bringing to the field? Okay, so this is not a magic video. This is just an excuse for me to talk about folk charms. Anything with good luck is the big one, right? This is something you find in like mass grave sites on battlefields all the time. But like good luck charms, that's what they're bringing. Good luck charms and religious paraphernalia. Like legitimately, McGeel, like that's like the most common thing in those areas. And literally, it's good luck charms and religious paraphernalia, right? Anything that's either going to get them alive the next day, help them dodge the arrow, dodge the fatal blow, come back in one piece, or anything that will ensure the eternal salvation of their soul, I think matters a ton. That's oh man. And if I'm gonna like give you a cool one, I'll base it off Voltaire, but what about like a double-sided crucifix? It's like on one side it's like whatever the dominant religion of the world is, and then on the other side is like the evil power. And like if you confront that soldier, they're like, I don't want to make enemies. I'm trying to play both sides. And literally, it's a flip of a coin every day whether the charm grants them some amount of luck or some amount of bad luck. That's what I would do. That's a cool one. I think that's what we'll do. And then Cadme, what would be a realistic response from a non-magic country against incoming high magic threats? Oh, you guys asked all the magic questions. No. Oh, all right, Cadme. If anyone is here at the video, I'll humor you on this one, my man. Just because you've been a good sport, and also your explanation of why you thought Aragorn wasn't a ranger was very interesting in the last video. So, what would there be a realistic response? Assassination. That would be the realistic response. Seriously, right? Like if you can't fight this person in a stand-up fight, you will do whatever you want to do to like take them out as soon as you can. That's what I would recommend. Military strategy can be developed using medieval technology and tactics. I will give you one more example. I will be coming to this question, I think, maybe again in the next video when it hits 400 likes. But Cadme, the one strategy that I think of all the time is the double envelopment, which was used by Hannibal Barca against Rome and is still in use today. It's still taught in Marine School. But essentially, you have a weak-looking front line, and you allow that line to collapse, and you put your best troops on the flanks, and then as the center line collapses, your flanks close in and surround the force. That is the best tactic, and I think that is a good place for us to end here. Those of you who asked questions in the Q&A, I thank you all. You guys were great, and I know that like I am kind of playing coy with these questions more so than usual, but I really don't want to like remove any and all impetus in getting us to the next video. That's probably why. So, okay, you are all fantastic. I really genuinely appreciate it. I will catch you all in the next one. I cannot wait to see what you all have to say about this. This was a video that I had so much fun making. I hope that people like it as much as I liked it, and if they don't, that's okay. That's, you know, that's the risk that you run with this whole YouTube shtick. But I had a blast. I loved every second of making this. So, all right, boys, peace out. Enjoy yourselves. Have a great rest of your night. I'm Kyle for Dorks. Y'all are amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.